Hey everybody, welcome back to Terminus, the borrowing the opening band's cab of extreme metal podcasts. I am the death metal guy, aka dealing with Gate Creeper in a purely self-defense situation.
And I am the black metal guy, aka goblin heretic.
Like a heretic that is a goblin or a goblin with heretical beliefs?
Wait, wouldn't those be the same?
Oh no, I mean you could be maybe a goblin posing as a priest in the church, and you're actually you're heretical because you are a goblin, or perhaps there is some sort of like mythic goblin animism that you are betraying as a goblin.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, you could either be a heretic. Okay, yeah, I see. No, a heretic who is that you could be a heretic from goblindom, in other words. Or you could be a goblin who is a heretic.
You're adopting the gnome gods instead.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to go for something nice and classic.
You're also just kind of describing like the Perverted Dexterity album cover with goblin heresies.
That's immediately what I thought of when I said that phrase, so I must be. I mean, that's certainly one of the most memorable album covers of the year.
I was about to say, I love how that album cover stuck with us. And I like how one of the guys on our Discord pointed out that it was actually part of a series of goblin album covers by that project that kind of tell us an evolving goblin shamanic story, which is so great for a brutal death band.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, man. All right, enough goblins. You know, we gotta talk about black metal, which is, you know, at least, I guess, tangentially goblin-esque. Real quick, no
goblin,
news.
I think goblin adjacent.
Goblin adjacency is... Yes, that sounds... That'll be the next wave of like modern political discussion.
Yeah, black metal, a genre nefariously associated with goblins,
and that's why it needs to change. discover the young new musicians fighting against goblins in black metal. All right, so. Oh, fuck. Alright, social media. If you haven't clicked off already, which I highly recommend, social media, me, the Death Metal Guy on Facebook, at Terminus Podcast, or the Black Metal Guy on Instagram, at Terminus Extreme Metal, or feel free to subscribe to us on Patreon or Subscribestar. $3 and up gets you access to the Terminus Prime bonus episodes, and $5 and up gets you access to the Terminus Black Circle, our private Discord server, which is also a circle, where you can discuss actually pretty elaborate topics today, like what's your favorite dinosaur, and a long analysis of the role of the Pacific Theater in World War II. It's getting heady. It's usually just me.
That actually sounds really good.
No, it was good. Yeah. We were me and Hyper Shaman and a couple other people were talking about the Pacific Theater and how it's a relatively ignored part of the overall historical context of World War II.
T-Rex.
T-Rex?
I went with. I got to go with a classic.
Oh, that's fair. Yeah, you got to post it in there, man. All right, so albums. We got some pretty big ones. We've got some stuff that probably a lot of you have been waiting for. And the first one, right off the bat, it's fucking Skepticism's Companion on Svart Records. No introduction needed. God knows we're both huge fans of Skepticism. This is the first record in 6 years since Ordeal from 2015. And spoiler, it's incredible and majestic, and you should buy it now. And we'll just spend some time talking about what makes Skepticism still one of the best bands in the world. Following that, another record that probably a lot of our listeners were waiting for, and we were too, is the new record by Aorlhac, titled Pierres, brûlées. I don't know.
Pierre Brûlé, yeah.
I don't know when the S is silent and when it's not.
Pierre Brûlé, yeah.
And this is released on Lecteurs de l'Ombres, or LADLO. Aorlhac is one of the original bands kind of responsible for developing the chivalric style of French black metal, as we like to call it. Something that's really been carried forth. We've covered a lot of stuff this year off the label Antic, which has really become kind of the hot spot for that style in a lot of ways. And this is one of the original guys, one of the original bands in the style coming back. So let's see how it compares after so many years of development within this little micro scene.
All right. And then after the break, we'll be back with another sort of parallel to Skepticism, another long-awaited return from Finland. This is Hautakammio with Pimeyden Kosketus on, of course, Purity Through Fire. It's loud and it's fast and it's Finnish, but it sounds like it came from Norway, and that's what you need to know. And finally, the very rapid follow-up to last year's debut record. This is Sylvan Coven by Gloosh on Drevo Recordings, which is basically his own label that has Gloosh and another band. And this is, I suppose, atmospheric black metal from Siberia, but as we will discuss, this record took a rather unexpected left turn.
All right, first up, Skepticism, Companion. It's phenomenal. We can just move on to the next one, but no. So we've talked on the show plenty about Skepticism. And we're both huge fans of Stormcrow Fleet, but have you ever listened to any like full Skepticism records after that, or do you just stick with that one?
I have basically just listened to I think I've listened to Ace after that, AES, but other than that, nothing. Which I really don't know why.
Yeah, I mean it's all incredible. So
yeah, it's yeah.
But I was just curious about that because it's interesting looking at people's responses to this record, and as people are talking about this, they're talking about the discography as well, and I'm starting to notice kind of just strange patterns in people being into Skepticism. So when I first started listening to metal and I first started listening to Skepticism, the last record that had come out was Pharmakon in 2003. And then over the years, we're now 3 albums past that. And back in the day, it seemed like everyone really rallied around Lead and Aether, the second album, as like the really huge one that everyone liked. But it seems like over the years, Stormcrow Fleet, the debut, has stuck as like the most influential and the one that people constantly go back to. So it's kind of interesting seeing how it's shifted over the years. But what I also found really interesting was apparently a lot of people didn't like Ordeal in 2015, which I think is a phenomenal record. But apparently there's been an accusation over the past few records that Skepticism has been leaning a little too into like modern romantic doom death. Which is, I get in a vague sense, just in that the past 2 or 3 records have been a little bit more accessible than the first 3, although I think Stormcrow Fleet is still a very accessible record.
I would agree. It's yeah,
it's not. I mean, it's like it's soundtrack romantic music.
It's not romantic particularly in any. I mean, in that sense, it's not florid. It's not gothy. But I find it pretty listenable. I don't know, or I think I always have. I think I always found it surprisingly listenable.
Yeah, so it's a very lush, very like pretty album. I remember I used to play it.
I find it
go ahead.
I find it comforting.
Yeah, no, definitely. I used to listen to it nonstop as a kid. I would listen to it in my house, and my dad would always call it like the soundtrack to a Kurosawa film, like The Seven Samurai or something, which is not a bad way to describe it.
Yeah.
So, with Companion, those kind of accessible ideas that people have been complaining about, Skepticism has really leaned into, but in what I think is a very interesting way. Because the thing that's going to immediately hit people when they hear this, and did hit people when the first single was released, Kala, the first track, is that it has some of the fastest material that Skepticism's ever done. That being said, Kala is like 70, maybe 80 beats a minute, so it's still very slow. But compared to, Lead and Aether, which is basically like 40 or 50 beats a minute the whole way through, yeah, it's basically speed metal. But what I found so interesting about this record is that, unlike other Skepticism records, which tend to revolve around a few simple but deep themes that are constantly rearranged and explored from different angles, this record feels like a compilation of very individual songs in a way that Skepticism's never really done before. Every one of these tracks has a very unique kind of identity. It's exploring very different musical ideas, still recognizably Skepticism, but very distinct. The process of listening to this record is not one uninterrupted kind of meditative state like the others. They're more vignettes of different, bigger stories. So I'm really interested because it almost feels like this is sort of an R&D record. And if I was to guess, I bet we're not going to have as long a drought between records for the next one as we did the last few. I have a feeling that Skepticism's kind of revitalized, and they're actively exploring new ideas in a very concrete way. And I think this is them figuring out what direction they want to take on the next one. That being said, this is an album with incredible songs. It's, without question, going on my end of the year list. And it's wonderful, as all Skepticism is. What did you think about it, especially without the context of all those middle albums?
What I threw me for a loop at first, honestly. I knew that. I think you had led me to expect that it might sound more like Stormcrow Fleet, or at least that's what was rumored. So when I heard it, I was sort of especially. I mean, I'd like to think I'd be able to. I recognized pretty quickly that that's not what was going on here, but I think it still surprised me. Let's say a slow surprise. So yeah, maybe judging by what you've said, maybe it's closer to the last few records. It strikes me as very different from Stormcrow Fleet. It seems structurally, there's a lot of prominent lead guitar here. Is that a feature of the newer records?
The last couple, and especially Ordeal, yeah, there's been a lot more prominent lead work.
Kala comes in with what's basically their version of an AC/DC riff. Like that's a sort of Hell's Bells arpeggio, or I suppose, AC/DC via October Tide and all those other bands.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of interesting, because I thought that one of my theses about this record is I think that this record is kind of moving through the discography in interesting ways. I think there's songs that tie to specific albums. And I actually thought that the first couple, like Kala and The Intertwined, actually struck me as being sort of like the biggest moments on Stormcrow Fleet, like The Gallant Crow or something like that.
The Intertwined does, for sure. The other thing that was weird to me about Kala was the tempo push. It's like the rhythms are all Funeral Doom rhythm, are all like, you can recognize the rhythms from Stormcrow Fleet, but they're just pushed strangely fast, almost a lower mid tempo, in a way that's like puts it in one of those weird tempo gray zones that I wasn't sure what to make of. Atmospherically, the record as a whole seems much more personal. Like, the songs are all very different, but they're emotive in a way that Stormcrow Fleet is not.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I think we both compared Stormcrow Fleet to like being in a landscape with no other people. Things like that. It's a very it has a kind of somber majesty, but in a very inhuman, remote way. Operates on a vast scale, changes slowly. It's one reason it's kind of uplifting is that it's just not very concerned with human suffering. There's a kind of majestic indifference, right? It's just like, here is the mountain. It continues standing there.
Well, that's why you've always described it as like a black metal record.
Yes, and also, I don't. You probably knew this, but it appears that 3 out of 4 members were in a black metal band that sort of didn't really go much. Like, I think I don't know. Like, did they release a bunch of demos and a full length in 2000? But 3 of the 4 current members were in a band called Thromdar.
Yeah, I've heard some of the really early Thromdar stuff.
Now I have to research this. I have to figure out what that band sounded like and how it related to Skepticism. But yeah. So Stormcrew Fleet for sure had something spiritually connected to black metal, and I'll get to that on my first sample. Well, you know what? Let's talk about that, and with reference to my first sample. Here is the only part that really, to me, really sounds like Stormcrow Fleet, and specifically the parts that like most jump out as sounding like black metal in some way, or super slow black metal. So this is the Intertwined. Okay, yeah, so bum ba bum bum ba da bum 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 bum, right? Mm-hmm. That is the melodic technique known as Conanism.
Just pure, like, barbarian triumph, but people always confuse what triumph means, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, now they use triumphant to mean sort of like happy.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he's Conan in the act of triumphing. Caught in the triumph, as it were, as he crushes his enemies and so on. But so the thing is, Stormcrow Fleet actually has a bunch of riffs that are kind of like that, or a lot like that. That's basically even the guitar tone. They're using those kinds of inverted power chords. Obviously, much more than just an inverted power chord. Those are big chords, but you know, sort of like 1/4 harmonizations instead of 1/5. Sounds a little more drony. And as you pointed out, here, as on Stormcrow Fleet, there are these. It's those intervals are very Gravelandy, especially that you were pointing out that little pentatonic turnaround flourish at the end of the phrase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember the first time I heard that. I've never heard them sound that distinctly Graveland, or even like I was like, wow, what's this like bluesy turnaround here? It really caught my ear the first time I heard it.
Oh, so so that's the most extreme version of that. But if you go back and listen, we've talked about this, I think it's more noticeable on the remastered Stormcrow Fleet.
Okay.
There's sort of those guitar textures come to the fore a little more, a little less murky, but you can hear more of that Gravelandy riffing, and it's again influenced by, hard to say, it's 95. I think that's the year Thousand Swords comes out. But, definitely some. We've talked about how right at around that time there was clearly something in the water with a number of bands. And Skepticism were distilling the pagan vibes in early black metal to something that elemental, right? But that's the only part of the record that does this. I mean, you get also those big descending doomy power chords a little later, and the sample also have something in common with that black metal Conan vibe. Disappears. And the mood for the rest of the record is very like, instead of being like, watching a glacier move, or maybe, Conan caught slow-mo in Triumphus Delicto. It sounds like a person having emotions. And that's not that's not at all what I was expecting. And that I tend to be biased towards more impersonal stuff in music, but damn if it wasn't, it was hard not to be won over.
It's very affecting.
Yeah.
And really looking back through the discography, Stormcrow Fleet is actually kind of the outlier in the Skepticism discography, because Skepticism's music has been intensely personal from Lead and Aether onward. I mean, it's entirely possible that Stormcrow Fleet was very personal, but it was couched in just much more abstract terms. As soon as you get to Lead and Aether and you get to songs like The March in the Stream, which has eight lines of lyrics, and there's some of the most heartbreaking stuff that's ever been written. It has a dedication to someone who's passed away at the end. And then ever since then, a lot of their work has been clearly very personal, but deeply abstract at the same time.
Yeah, this seems like a love story transposed into onto a mythic level. There's the intertwined. Okay, that's pretty, love scene. March of the Four. I don't know. Passage, a moment of confrontation or conflict, the inevitable doom, and then the last track, which is this very sweet title, right? The Swan and the Raven, right? So, seems like it's reflecting on a past relationship, or a dead spouse, or a current relationship. Even it's funeral doom, so it's hard to know.
Yeah, no, I get you.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of relationship stuff, the March of the Four is what I'm going to look at next, and it's weird. I don't think I've ever seen anyone bring this up, but this is the fourth in a series of songs, starting with the March in the Stream from Lead and Aether, into March October from Alloy, and March Incomplete on Ordeal. Which I assume probably all revolve in some way around this individual that the song was dedicated to. Which is, and the March in the Stream is a cornerstone of Skepticism. It is one of their most important songs. There's always been this sort of quiet mythos around it. They don't talk about it. They've never explained what it's about. They kind of refuse to. But it's always been crucial. But then there's been the sequence of songs that evolve from that original route on Lead and Aether. Kind of similar to the way that Skepticism used to put out a lot of EPs in relation to full-length records. There was the Ether EP before Lead and Aether, there was A's, and then there was the Process of Pharmacon before Pharmacon, which usually had different arrangements of songs from the related albums. Sort of full-fledged, like almost orchestral rearrangements. And they're fascinating, and more people should listen to them. But let's listen to what I'm guessing may be the final sequence of the March songs. Let's listen to the March of the Four. So it probably goes without saying, but this album is kind of impossible to sample because, all of these songs are just continuous flows of ideas running into each other and transforming. It really does not do any of these tracks justice. But that slice, and that was a long one, that was about close to 3 minutes long. The sheer number of ideas and the number of things that happen in that sequence is just way beyond anything Skepticism's done on previous records. It's not just that the tempos are a little bit higher on this record, it's the volume and the pace of the ideas is dramatically accelerated. Because older Skepticism stuff, especially, Lead and Aether, Pharmacon, Stormcrow Fleet, of course, were very content to dwell on very small variations of a simple idea, almost like ambient music. But here, these songs have explosive moments, multiple throughout the tracks that really keep your attention. Other Skepticism records are much more meditative. This is for active listening. And and just the sheer number of peaks and valleys these guys manage to pack into these songs is incredible. I mean, in that sequence, we had like 3 major, like, emotionally revelatory moments in the context of the song. It's unbelievable, you know, just the mastery and the ability to pull that off without these sort of gestational phrases, I would call them. You know, these tension building figures.
Oh, yeah. With the intertwined too, it was kind of like that. The thing that I like, there wasn't so much a developmental thing happening in the part I sampled as just like 4 huge riffs that were kind of like worth hanging out in on their own, right? Each one kind of, but somehow they're getting from each is throwing into the next in a very necessary way. It doesn't, I suppose the general structure on Intertwined was something like crushing riff, more abstract riff, different crushing riff, more dissonant, and then like you get into the sort of organ heavy kind of big release riff. But they're all important, and they move through them at quite a clip without sounding scattered.
Yeah, it's I think it's really impressive just how, and I'll get to this more on my final sample, but the ability of this band at this point in their career to guide the listener emotionally through exactly what they want them to experience at a kind of incredible pace. You know, the tremendous swings between triumph and sorrow that can happen so quickly across this whole album are, you know, there's very little music I've heard that is able to do that as cleanly and as effectively and stick the landing every single time.
So we had very different reactions to that, the big riff at the beginning of the sample. That might be worth sharing with the audience. When I first heard that, my da, 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 I was like, oh, I was like, whoa, that's like a rather indulgent pop hook. That's almost it's very soundtracky, right? And it's close to a lot of trope melodies. It's sort of Lord of the Rings soundtracky, right? Like big moment at the end of Lord of the Rings. And I had this moment like, oh God, am I trying to be convinced of an emotion? That moment hit you really hard.
Oh yeah, that was huge. I mean, I'm a little bit more primed for it just because I listened to so much Funeral Doom. But yeah, that was. You see, for me, the first couple tracks, like Kala is great. The Intertwined is a little bit more abstract, and I like the kind of wandering, shifting mood in it. And then for me, the March of the Four was the first time where it's like, it's this incredible release. It was almost like the first 2 tracks were building tension for that moment for me.
Well, so as this song moved and then built back to that crest again at the end, this sort of, they just hang on it more towards the end of the track and really just like make that melody sing. And I start to realize, okay, at this point, it's being repeated with the sort of gravity and kind of focus that characterized Stormcrow Fleet. That made me realize, oh, this is like they're fully that wasn't a hook. This is like the this is the point of the song, and it carries weight. And the repetitions accumulated behind it and gave it more power. And I think, I think it just made me change my optic too, where I was like, okay, they're in control of what's happening here. Like they must know that the orchestral arrangement on this track, the way these are harmonized, sounds more like pop arrangements, right? And I mean using pop very, very loosely here to say like things in rock music, things and more. I don't know. This could be like
things in music that the public at large would understand. You know.
Yeah, I mean, like that Scott Walker song about Ingmar Bergman, which I'm sure these guys like. It's just big orchestral arrangements, and it's, but like they so I think I figured it out on this. Right? It's like, okay, this is just how they want us to listen to the album, and then it just is a really affecting melody. And I think at that point, like, I bought it. And then I was, like, instantly like, oh, this is the best track on the record so far. Yeah. And when I got to the end, I still thought it's the best track on the record.
Well, I think I think that a lot of this relates to what I was talking about, that accusation of, Skepticism has slipped into, like, regular kind of romantic funeral doom or doom death. And, my response to that is, oh, so you mean that they're adopting influences from stuff like Catatonia or Amorphous or Paradise Lost? You mean bands that they were fucking contemporaries of during their prime? Because everyone seems to forget that Skepticism has been a band since 1991. Stormcrow Fleet came out in 95, but their very first release, their single, Towards My End, that was 92. Like, this is not a band, God, Jesus Christ. The arrogance of people suggesting that Skepticism, of all bands, is a band grasping for straws at, like, more popular bands is insane. The development of Peaceful Doom Death was concurrent with this band coming up, So, really, I think they're reaching back probably to a lot of the same things they were listening to from the very beginning. They're just approaching it in a different way. Yeah.
And to things that, I mean, when I try to think of, like, some of, like, what I meant by, like, a poppy harmony, I'm thinking, like, da 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 da, right, on the strings as the guitars climb down the progression. That could be in, like, a Chameleon song. Like, any number of kind of, like, post-punky 80s acts. It has that kind of eerie intermediate mood. It's, I don't know, it's not, it doesn't sound like Catatonia.
Yeah, it's not, but I see what they mean. It's like, okay, you've got these more, it's riffier. Yes, obviously the band is riffier now, but that's not. I guess I resent the implication that that's some sort of like cop out on the band's part after they've been around for 30 goddamn years.
Right. No, I think this track made me figure okay, they simply are playing a very different kind of music from the kind of music I thought they were going to be playing, and once I recalibrated, this album makes a lot of sense and gets about as much profundity out of gestures like that as you possibly can.
Anyway, so your next sample.
Oh, the other reason you were probably primed for that to hit you big is that you probably saw the title. Oh. You were probably like, oh shit, it's the March song.
Oh, yeah. Oh, definitely. Like, the March songs always have excess emotional weight within their albums. So, this is, what I'm wondering about this sample, I guess this is another black metal adjacent thing, in a way, but in a way that's very unlike Stormcrow Fleet, and really unlike anything I expected from this band. And what I want to hear from you is this, did they ever do something like this before? So this is the passage. Oh, and the sample comes on after about a minute and... we're starting about a minute and 20 seconds in, and up till this point, it's all been tension-building lead guitar in this vein.
pretty evil.
Yeah, that's some of the like grimmest stuff that Skepticism's ever done.
I mean, that's almost a breakdown. Sort of trudges a little more, but what I'm reminded, so like opening with that, like a minute and over almost 2 minutes of sort of like it's tuned too low to be needling exactly, but sort of sort of keening, sharp, dissonant trem, right? Sort of Hall of the Mountain King trem for well over a minute and a half. It's basically their sort of I Am the Black Wizards or Jesus Toad intro. This track,
yeah, definitely. Well, the question is this kind of referenced elsewhere in the discography?
Yeah.
To a degree, this is a really heightened version of it, but actually this reaches way, way back. This reaches back to the band's first single, Towards My End. It was a little 2-track 7-inch. Very few people have actually bothered to go back and listen to it. But at that phase, Skepticism was more of a death metal band. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, go. Well, the other things I was thinking of as I listened to it this time more, right? It sounds like before the black metal, death metal branching. And it sounds like the Finnish death metal bands like Demigod and Sentenced.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So originally, Skepticism, obviously that first 7 inches, it's very strange. It's very unformed. It's fascinating music, but I'm not going to say that it's something I would ever regularly listen to. But what it really is like a very strange streak of Scandinavian death metal with a big... There's a hint at what Skepticism would later do. In terms of like their just the very strange harmonic ideas. And then the other thing that relates to that would be their third record, Pharmakon, which I would say is kind of their darkest record. It kind of it's their most abstract. I'd say it's their most difficult record in the discography. It takes a lot of listens to really sink in, and then it starts to gel together. But rarely across Pharmakon will you find anything that has the sort of like triumphant notes that we're used to from other Skepticism records. Or not, and really not a lot of like regular kind of sad stuff either. It's just kind of gloomy and murky and introspective. It's really fascinating. So this is precedented, but I think there's a lot of ideas on this record that are relating to ideas from earlier in the discography, but all of them have been pushed to their limits. All of them have been heightened in a really dramatic way.
Kind of distilled, like, hey, what if we did something like the first 7-inch, but like with everything we've learned since?
Yeah. And that's kind of a theory of mine about this record. Is I think that each song is relating to a different part of the discography. This is almost like
that.
Yeah,
interesting.
I think each one of these tracks is referential to a different period of the band. So it's like Kala. I think that's a play off the first track from Alloy. The Intertwined is Stormcrow Fleet. The March of the Four is it's an expansion on the March sequence, so that reflects back on Lead and Aether. Passage is more Pharmakon, etc.
Well, that's these are some highly unsubstantiated Skepticism conspiracy theories.
Skepticism is the kind of band that would do that.
This makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you know a lot about this. Like, shit, you know a lot about this band.
Yeah, I've spent a lot.
Death metal guy, I hate to say it, but I'm impressed.
Death metal guy, or in some circles, the doom metal guy.
Yes, I suppose so.
This is just my take on it. Skepticism's an interesting band because they've never really something has changed relatively recently for Skepticism, which is like since the last full-length record Ordeal, they've become much more active publicly. There was a sort of a short documentary on the band that someone filmed. Like a 30-minute documentary talking to all the guys, just a local guy from Finland, I assume. But Skepticism have almost never done interviews, never done any sort of public appearances. I think they've probably done certainly less than 100, possibly less than 50 shows ever. They've always been very private, but now they're starting to come out a little bit more. And I could see this being related to it.
I saw an interview with them, like, sitting at a picnic table in the middle of a festival.
Yeah, it's very strange for Skepticism.
And they were in their full, tuxedos, and they were very sort of chill and matter of fact. There was no, it was very,
there's no pretense whatsoever.
Yeah, they were not trying to be. They simply were in their tuxedos. They were not trying to. They were not in grand artiste mode. Nor were they attempting to sell you on what sort of fun regular guys they were. It was just It was as if they'd been doing interviews like that the whole time, and it was surprising. And it was like surprisingly open.
Yeah, it's the most Finnish thing possible.
Yes, there wasn't. There wasn't anything. Yeah, there was no insecurity or pretense of any kind.
That's
pretty cool.
Something I've always respected about them a lot. But to wrap things up, my final sample, it's coming off the final track of the record, The Swan and the Raven, which in this case is probably referential to Pharmacon's The Raven and the Backward Funeral. So maybe they're starting a new sequence here of related tracks.
Also to the fleet of fucking Stormcrows.
Yeah, and there's been several references to crows and ravens, and I bet.
Oh, there's the Gallant Crow also.
There's the Gallant Crow. I believe there's another crow song, but that's just escaping my memory now. But this is going to be kind of like what you heard on the March of the Four, and just again, let's just look at the mastery of shifting moods that this band has. So yeah, it's like I said, so much of this record is two moments reflecting each other forever. Sorrow and triumph, and sorrow and triumph, and finding the elements of each in each other. This perpetual waltz of these two ideas of, kind of an odd comparison, but imagine kind of a bro-y, tough, hardcore record where it's about struggle and it's about triumph over it. This endless repeating cycle, the eternal recurrence of warfare within a person. And Skepticism obviously goes about that idea in a very different way, but it feels like so much of Skepticism's music is based on these infinite cycles. Like on Stormcrow Fleet, no song is just a song. It is every song on Stormcrow Fleet is 10 minutes and then an invisible eternity around it, stretching in both directions.
That's kind of like the Hate Forest effect.
Yeah, or Forest, or any great black or doom metal band, really.
This is, I see what you mean about the sort of all, you could see the, what you say about the intertwinedness, right? I mean, I could really hear that passage as a single, extremely sustained mood. But if you wanted to divide it into triumph and sorrow, right, you could basically take, there's the, bum, 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 right? That is maybe first sorrowful, and then there's this sort of arpeggiated build, and then when the thing that sounded sorrowful before hits again, it sounds more like a big, powerful release. So it sounds there's like constant contextual inversions between what sounds like a more of a falling off and what sounds more like rising here.
Yeah. I mean, and there's a big chunk of that sample is dominated by a single melodic theme on the guitar that is played triumphantly once and then slowed down deliberately, changing the entire context of it and giving it that sorrowful quality.
Yeah, this may actually be my favorite song on the record. I don't know. I'll have to go back and find out, but that was fucking awesome. And this, as far as things this connects to, I think this connects to a specific song also, which is The Rising of the Flames on Stormcrow Fleet.
Yeah. I think in a way, everything in their discography does.
Hi, this is Taylor from Crushing the Scepter, and you're listening to Terminus Podcast.
All right, and we are back with Aorlhac's Pierres brûlées out on LADLO, Lactose de l'Ombre. So, we always do this thing. It's like, I bring 2 records, Black Metal Guy brings 2 records. I just happened to catch this one coming up before he did. I really don't own this one. The Black Metal Guy is the one who has all the background knowledge for Aorlhac, so you go ahead, man. You tell us the kind of relevant historical information here.
Well, thanks, bud. This is a band I've mentioned on the show basically as much as I can, because I feel like they're the fathers of the chivalric style of French black metal that we talk about. That has, come to fruition lately in bands like Vehemence on the Antic label. This year we've also reviewed the Passéisme record, which is a strong, very strong entry in that style. To some extent, the Interlude, also an Antic band.
A kind of like punkier take on it.
Yeah, punky, but still pretty medievally. I think the other really big name in this style, not connected to Antic, would be a Sunopfer, which is we mentioned frequently as an example of a drummer band. That is an extremely riffy band where you can tell that the riffs are still being driven by the drums because the guy's a drummer. Is his first instrument. But those Vehemence and Sunopfer, I think, have gotten a lot of the press, at least overseas. In part because Aorlhac had a long period of inactivity. So basically, Aorlhac's first full length was À la Croisée devant in 2008, and then I actually haven't heard that one. I know them from La Cité devant in 2010, and then they spent about 8 years off, returning only with L'Esprit devant in 2018. And so in that time, a lot of these other bands emerged. And by the time they came out, they were more like fellow, one band among many in a field that they had kind of helped clear the way for. So what's the deal with them? Well, so Aorlhac is a sort of adaptation of the name Aurillac, which is their hometown, but it's made to sound more like the native language, the sort of pre-French or quasi-French native language of the region, Occitan, or the Languedoc. That means language of Oc, the province, the region. That's the name is something like Aorlhac, but that's not any fancy knowledge on my part. That's Metal Archives. But I can give you some fancy knowledge in the form of the history of the Occitan region, which is this, before the modern nation state, the paradigmatic modern nation states are France really, in some sense, had a more coherent idea and identity than Germany did earlier. But even so, France in many ways was a political project, and it was assembled from different regions, stitched together by the monarchy, and then, in the 19th century, by the sort of the emerging state, or emerging sort of democratic state, and or I should say Republican, who knows? The government changed a lot. Anyway, point being, France is a compound of regions that predate anything like the modern idea of it. And one of them was this southern, the Occitan region in southern France, and also extends down into Spain. And this was the country of the troubadours, who were not just sort of, bard class characters, but also knight class characters. That is, they were mostly nobles who composed poetry, right? Where the sort of the poetry and the music were inseparable from each other. The innovations there were inspiring to Dante and to all sorts of waves of poetry afterward. And the region was associated with one of the largest intra-European crusades, which was the Albigensian Crusade against heretics in the province. These are referred to sometimes as the Cathars or the Albigeois. And there is a long-standing suspicion, right, that what happened here was not so much a Christian heresy as a survival, maybe a crypto-Christian survival, or a crypto-pagan survival of an older religion in this region, maybe blended with Christianity and sort of encoded in the songs of some of the troubadours. And so there's something very black metal about this region, obviously. And, it was black metal enough, apparently, that the medieval church decided it had to be crusaded. So there's a long, pretty cool history in this region. And they're tapping into that. We've already played on this show a song that taps directly into that history, Sans Fleur, La Cité devant. So we played it on an interlude. So I thought instead, let's get a sense of this band's core sound by checking out something from L'Esprit devant. They had with the 8 years off, they had a lot of time to write songs. And this is their masterpiece, and I would say maybe like the premier record in this style. But here's a sample from one of the later tracks on it, Laura e Vanguda. So did you notice that one part, that massive fucking mountain of a riff?
Oh, you mean all of them?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Well, I especially like the one that sounds very piratey towards the end.
The one that, yeah, it's got a folk melody, yeah.
Yeah. Got kind of a swashbuckling quality, I like that.
Yeah, so, the cool thing is, the fact that I can sing that there isn't just because I spend way too much time trying to hum riffs on Terminus. It's because it's written for guitar like a melody that could be sung.
Yeah.
I could even imagine a crowd of drunk French people in a football stadium chanting that. It sounds like it's... Who knows? Maybe it's sourced from a folk song, but I think it's just a really huge melody. And they've made it repeat, even though it turns around, like it should maybe go into like a verse or another part of the song, they've managed to make it repeat like a riff. The other mastery of the arrangement there is that they do a, I don't know, the whole riff has this kind of like rise, fall thing, peak, valley. Each one of those, the riff rolls in on a slowdown, right? It's sort of like I don't know, it's not like halftime, it just comes out of blast into sort of like rolling, steep deceleration. Then just revs up into a blast after one rep. They escalate the blast, and then they go back into the rolling mid-tempo feel at the end. So it's like kind of the opposite, or just a very different way from how people would normally structure a chorus. Yeah, that's you can see why I like this band, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that record ruled. I was really stoked about this record when I heard it coming out. I have to say, I am a little bit disappointed, which is a hard thing for me to say, so frankly, about a band that I am deeply invested in. I suspect it's a case of, trying to write a follow-up album as soon as you can, right?
Yeah.
But the mood here is, the songwriting is different and the mood is quite different. How did it hit you?
Well, for me, it's kind of a strange case, just because it's sort of like when we did that bonus episode about Incantations Onward to Golgotha, where you talked about the issue about having not heard it before, but having heard so many of the things that it's influenced and so many of the various threads that were picked up from it, it's kind of weird going back to the origin. Mm-hmm. That was a feeling that I got on this record. It's like, oh, okay, so this is basically the center of this style that I really like, but I haven't heard the original. Mm-hmm. Or at least not in any substantial measure. You know, I've heard a song here and there. It's... You see, I don't really have enough knowledge to be disappointed or to be elated, but I did get the feeling while listening to it, I felt like this probably wasn't what was expected from this band. Because the way this scans to me is not really so much... I mean, it is kind of by default a chivalric French black metal record. But the things that I kept hearing across it were a lot closer to, like, melodic death metal a lot of the time. Or, like, kind of old Cradle of Filth riff patterns. A lot of which are enjoyable, but it did feel all the way through that there was something missing. Some sort of component. And I think that maybe it would be a little bit more forgivable if it was like, you know, another band's debut record or something, which might be unfair on my part. But I'm just saying, you know, for a band like Aorlhac with this kind of legacy behind them, and, you know, with the recommendation of somebody that I respect a lot, like you, I didn't get the sense... I got the sense that it's like, I wasn't missing something that you probably had misgivings about this too, you know?
Yeah, for sure. No, we talked about that before the show. And, it does not... It is notably, in several ways, quite different from what I was expecting. So let's try... I'll try to zero in on that a little more. This is the first... this is the first track on the record, and honestly, it kind of threw me for a loop, and the loop kind of continued until, like, the last couple tracks. This, I think the record is about a volcano, but I can't make out whether
the art
it's
is very odd.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's cool art, and it's probably done by the same person who did the cover to L'Esprit Divin, which has an incredible cover. I should buy it physically still. But it's hard to make out what it has to do with the music. So this track is called La Colère du Volcan, which is something like the wrath of the volcano, but it does not sound very volcanic. Man, that was slow.
That was weird. That was...
Yeah.
I definitely got the sense of a... I mean, maybe this is unfair without the background knowledge, but the sense of a band imitating themselves.
And not even themselves, because their old stuff doesn't sound like that. It has moments. So what's crazy about this is that the mood of melancholy, and I'm using that term in the strong sense, not just to mean sort of sad or mournful or inflicted with emotional pain, but this kind of like halfway emotion where, sort of like the classic example of melancholy is like attraction to something that's gone, but it can't be, the longing can't be shaken, and you're kind of in this emotional limbo. The chords are, they're not despairing, they're just kind of irresolute.
It's kind of there.
Yeah, they sort of, and it's just strumming, it's, strum the dolorous minor chord progression, which puts them much more in the realm of things that people would, as a cliche, sometimes an unfair one, associate with French black metal. It's, basically we start with a blast build-up, which even that is kind of already hanging out in this kind of melancholy minor territory, and then just drop into these slowly strummed chords, and the chords, they have this kind of the remarkable thing about Aorlhac before is the searing clarity of every idea. You heard just that stream of rolling melody in Laura S. Vanguda, right?
Yeah.
And it's not because it's all focused on leads. I mean, the remarkable thing is that almost all of those riffs are based on dense harmonies, but they're sort of melodies that are played as chords and therefore have their own close following harmony with them. Their grasp for those kinds of ideas is unmatched, and it goes with this mood that occasionally turns towards more, mournfulness, occasionally becomes sorrowful or tense or whatever, but is pretty much always generally just affirmative and noble, and has a lot of, masculine forward moving. This is more sort of anemic romantic lamenting.
This feels like a case of this, again, kind of grasping here, but this feels like a band that it's like, oh, we want to mature, we want to go a little bit more internal, a little bit more intellectual, but they don't realize that the turns they're making
being intellectual sucks.
Well, yes, that. And that the turns that they're taking to do that just bring it closer to very normal music.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, also just, I think the point, I thought of a clearer way to say what I was just saying before about the chords. It's like, you can just hear the difference between the tight sort of tremolo chording that they use, and then those big, like, 4 or 5 string strummed things that are kind of close to bar chords. Right? And instead of those, and you can make versions of those that are, you could do chords like that are powerful in all sorts of ways and have nuance in them. But here it's almost like the different tones, the different intervals are sort of interfering with each other to come out in this kind of halfway zone. Bands that do something like that kind of well are the Dutch.
Yeah. They have that weird, moody, gray atmosphere.
Yeah, but then that's like where that's their primary material almost for some of them. But here it's just, here it is, seems like noise in the signal of the, sort of something that is not this band's native territory. And what a strange compositional move to just like power in on the blasts and then drop into that section, which, and as you're saying, I think maybe it is an attempt to sort of, take a different path abruptly, but it doesn't. It's I don't think it lands for either of us.
No, it doesn't. Well, so let me get to one of my samples. So this is where we're going to explore kind of like my angle on the whole thing, which is that this record, I mean, even just based off the limited amount of Aorlhac I've heard before, this record seems really substantially influenced by melodeath and power metal and like kind of old Cradle of Filth. And specifically what I'm talking about are these kind of gestural riffs that are based around simple kind of classical stem melodies that just get worked around the fretboard. An obvious example... Oh, go ahead.
You've been talking about simple classical stem melodies getting worked around the fretboard a lot lately. How is this different from lymphatic phlegm?
Well, one, lymphatic phlegm is really cool.
Okay, yes, yeah, totally different sound. But what I mean is like,
sound. Yeah.
What do you mean about it here? Yeah.
So what I mean about it here is, okay, so what you're about to hear is a 4-note melody that gets worked around the fretboard in a few different ways and then ends in a flourish. The obvious comparison that everyone's going to be familiar with is going to be the opening riff to Funeral in Carpathia on Dusk in Her Embrace by Cradle of Filth. And that's fine. I don't mind that kind of riff writing, but it comes up a lot on this record. Like, what you're about to hear is one of the primary kind of riff techniques. And like I said, I don't necessarily mind it, and I think it's kind of cool, the idea of using that as a building block, but I do wonder if this is the direction the band wants to take, given their history of, like, much more elaborate harmonic language. So this is a sample off the second track, Au Travers de nos Cris, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, just listen to that melodeath figure riff, and then when we get to the end of it, I'll talk about what makes it less useful in this situation than in some other bands. It's kind of like a be-do-ba-do, 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 be-do-ba-do. Just change that root note, and then, I mean, the overall effect you get is something akin to like a Sargeist riff or something, where it's just like, oh, just change the root note and keep doing that pattern of the high melody. It's like and
the chords underneath it are like rhythm chording that is firing well below this band's capacity.
Yeah, there's something about this, like, especially just from the samples you've showed me of older stuff, it's like, it really feels like the band's kind of slumming it on this. Like, it's like, we know they can operate at a much higher level. And the thing is, there's there's bands where that kind of riff really would have a ton of weight, but it's all based on context. There's something about this record that feels like it's the band operating at 65%. You know?
Yeah.
Like,
And I really could hear the Cradle. I don't even know Cradle that well, but I could, as soon as you pointed it out to me, I was like, oh yeah, that Cradle of Filth, or yeah, the Stargeist thing. And even the galloping riff following it works on the same principle, right? Right?
I mean, I like that one more just because it has more like more of a dynamic rhythm. But
no, it does. It's got more
the same idea.
It's got more of a shape, but it's basically the same vertical idea, stretched out more, made a little more like a heavy metal riff. And they're doing the same move the root note under it, like da 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 da, which we all know is a great progression, but you know they're different ways to do that. Yeah, man. Yeah, even that part at the end, right? They started to get some melodic clarity towards the end with that, but it still had this the last lick, but it had this still kind of like crestfallen vibe. Just
Why do you sound so sad, guys? Like, what's up? What happened?
Maybe it's being sad about a volcano blowing up, you know, but like I don't. I looked up volcano south of France, and I didn't find much except an island volcano that went off in the 1830s. So there must be some backstory here that we don't understand.
Something like that.
So this is... I perked up towards the end of the record. It is... I don't think it's... You know, I still... It is not... you know, it wasn't jaw-dropping, but it did sound much more like the same band. In particular, La Guerre de Esclope, which means something like War of the Slaves, is a... Again, there's like regional history stuff that must be just somewhere, but there's no interview for it yet. But this one sounds more like something you could have heard off La Cité des Vents, where there's this kind of more immediate influence from Norse second wave. So we will check this out. This one's fun. the end of a record that hangs out pretty consistently in this sort of melancholy, epic kind of territory. That kind of tightness and drive is a welcome change.
It's got more of a center to it.
Yeah, it's and there you get. I've read in an interview that this band, they're not that. You could attempt to trace a genealogy of this sort of more knightly style back to stuff that has, I don't know, back to like Hiralorn and Seigneur Voland and stuff. But apparently this band was not very influenced by French black metal. They said they mostly liked Norwegian stuff, maybe Swedish stuff, and like Iron Maiden. And that I think the vocalist was into DSBM. Mm-hmm. And you can hear all those things coming together in various ways. Here, but so this has some of that more sort of, let's say, undigested or immediate Scandinavian influence, and those are relatively standard kind of like ripping Motorhead second wave riff, right? But
I was going to say black metal Motorhead stuff, yeah.
Yeah, just the fact that they're so good technically, I feel like they're more excited about playing this part, and so their ability to like fill in the sonic space with these little bends and embellishments that comes to the fore more. I
get that. I mean, what you're saying is kind of what we've been saying through this whole review. Mm-hmm. This is a band that we know is capable of more. So why doesn't it come through here?
Yeah, I think I think the mood changes in the last couple tracks, and I wonder if there wasn't a good sort of change of mood here. Maybe there was an album in these.
Yeah! possible, remplacer la nature, que ce soit le règne enfin de tous les faux produits fabriqués, de tous les ignobles ersatz synthétiques. La belle nature vraie n'a que faire et doit céder une fois pour toutes et honteusement la place.
All right, and we're back from a break featuring even more rants. There's been a lot of good sort of off-air Terminus rant content tonight. But we're back from that with some ranting and raving Finnish black metal courtesy of the Angry Hermits and Hautakammio. This is Pimeyden Kosketus, out on the International Clearinghouse for Finnic black metal, Purity Through Fire. So, Hautakammio is probably not a household name, even if you're somewhat into Finnish black metal, because it is a project that hasn't been around for some time. Kind of like, both. I guess that's a common thread with the Skepticism and with Aorlhac. Long intervals between recordings. But this was my one of my gateways into Finnish black metal, alongside Vitsaus and Sylvan, back in probably 2014, 15. And what was, I had come up as a sort of Norse Swedish purist, and come of age in a time when it was very fashionable to like Satanic Warmaster and shit talk Emperor, whereas I liked Emperor and shit talked Satanic Warmaster. Ha! Now, of course, it's based...
I was about to say, oh, how the tables have turned.
Yeah, well, now it's, exactly, now sort of, also now it's obvious that Satanic Warmaster is one of its primary influences is Emperor, I think. I think Werewolf has made that abundantly clear in the angles he's pursued on that project since. But yeah, so it was, Satanic Warmaster got identified with this highly melodic style, and, I, for whatever reason, thought I was more just invested in this, dissonant grinding Norse stuff, neglecting that half of Satanic Warmaster is dissonant grinding power chords. Anyway, these bands, Vitsaus has the classic Finnish chording, but is much sort of darker melodies and much kind of very long, elaborate folk-based melodies. Sylvan Vahonen we already reviewed, sort of stompy, angry, sort of like nasty kick-in-the-teeth black metal. And Hautakammio is really sounds, in some ways, more Norwegian than Finnish. But what's very Finnish about it is the fact that it has been the essentials of the Norwegian sound have been the Norwegian sound has been boiled back down to some essential characteristics delivered in highly compressed, kind of alternating song structures. And you know, back when their first two records came out in 2013 and 2014, back to back, there was virtually no other modern stuff that sounded like this. That is sort of rooted in the second wave, but with a kind of without some sort of retro gimmick to it. Just a powerful forward production. And then they went away for a long time, and I think that long silence is probably because the members are busy with other stuff. You know, all the Finns are in a bunch of bands. The vocalist Vritron is in White Death, and he's also in the Vritron Werewolf collaboration. That is the Werewolf of Satanic War Master, which I think just released a record or something.
Yeah, there was one earlier this year.
Yeah, and then Grim 666, the strings guy, is in the prolific Atmo Black act Common Kantaya, and the drummer Lima is in bands like Azagal and Lathe Spell, both of which are pretty established, but I haven't really followed. Anyway, point is, this is a meeting of the minds that occurs, when the stars are right. How does this record sound? Well, it sounds like Hautakammio. So basically, the only change I can really detect is that the melodies might air, in fact, more, maybe less brash epic melody here, and more focus on sort of spooky Norse stuff, and the production is a little bit cleaned up, but thankfully very loud. What do you make of this one?
Well, black metal guy, I'm going to record a disclaimer at one point for my opinions on all these heavily second wave influenced nowadays records, which is, this. Obviously, this isn't my thing, but at this point, I think I've gathered enough information about it to tell when it's good and when it's bad, and Hautakammio is good. This is not, to me, the most exciting music. As far as, like, modern takes on second wave, the obvious one is going to be Gyendod. But Gyendod has just, like, a severe weirdness to them that really appeals to me. Hautakammio is playing it a little bit closer to the core. However, it's obviously extremely respectable, rigorous black metal. Touching on something you said, the production is kind of odd on this record for this style. And I'm going to get into that a little bit when it comes to my samples, but the guitar tone is very kind of reverb and delayed out, but like to a degree beyond, even Day Mysteries. It's kind of strange. Kind of like it ends up with those kind of glassy, clean tones, almost that like invisible synthesizer effect you get from some really blown out black metal guitar tone, which is kind of interesting combined with the really kind of raw, just really aggressive barreling style of black metal on here. And I think sometimes it's an advantage and sometimes it's a disadvantage. So obviously this is a band that is heavily influenced by what we would expect. Dark Throne, Burzum, early Emperor, I think, is a big thing. EP and Split era Emperor.
Yeah. Only true Emperor.
We've already had that debate.
Yeah.
I like how I'm the death metal guy and I'm the only true Emperor guy. But there's also touches of more modern stuff. There's some sort of take type stuff, which is also related to Gyendod, which, take is not chronologically nowadays black metal, but you know what I mean. It's reflecting kind of different ideas in it.
I think there was more of the Toke type stuff in the older stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I gotcha. I mean, it's definitely, there's parts of it where it's really distinct here. But really what this is kind of, at least to me, a guided tour of Norwegian black metal circa 93. It's it's interesting. You get to, there's records like this where you can play the game of, which band to which riff, And I think they're kind of celebrating that on this record, and that's totally fine. Like, this is black metal for dedicated, rigorous black metal people, and, regardless of, my own taste, I can respect that for what it is.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so, let's, how about some blast beats and screaming? This is Harhazen Milan Termlia. All right, Termlia. Yeah, there we go. Death metal guy, I can't count higher than 4. How many times did they repeat that?
The big lead riff? I think that was Yeah.
Yeah.
That was
okay, it's just
they do 4 with one drum beat and backing chords, and then they shift it a little bit for the second half.
Yeah, it's just a long riff because it's got 2 parts to it. Yeah, yeah, so that is, in a way, that's the biggest riff on the record. They just open with that. Like, that's, in terms of, like, massive hook riffs, they just lead with that. Is that a fair assessment?
There's some stuff later on the record that's kind of similar, but that gesture is the main kind of, like, big driving riff.
Yeah. That's the big moon through the clouds part.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, listening to it, so first of all, like, the amount of repetitions is very different from nowadays black metal. And I mean, they usually, now that things have slipped more verse chorus, usually you repeat the big epic part maybe less than the verse riffs in some way, especially when it's that long, right? You might go through like, 4 reps or something. That's like twice as long as the ear would expect it to be based on that. It's getting and it really sustains its own weight. Like there's no it doesn't need to go anywhere. Like they could play it another 8 times. And that's a pretty interesting idea. There's a certain kind of songwriting skill that goes into that. We call it the infinite riff on the show, right? The sort of the thing that just turns back on itself and loops indefinitely. That has this sort of self-contained power that's pretty cool. But this leads us to the production. Real quick before I get to the production. Stylistically, in terms of name that riff, it would seem like what they're doing is applying the Transylvanian hunger principle to an Emperor riff.
Yeah, I think that's something we both landed on listening to this, which is a lot, really heavy early Emperor influence in terms of riffcraft, but with a really chunky kind of raw structuring a la Dark Throne Classic era.
Yeah, the slow part before this sounded very authentically Dark Thronian too. Like Fenris would have dressed the drums up more, but something about the understatement there and just sort of the trot on it was very Fenris.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, it's and sort of the idea of like droning repetition. Again, people always associate that with the second wave, but in fact, the only band that did really wall of blast beats like that, the only record that's really like that is Transylvanian Hunger. The occasional Burzum song. But Dark Throne, hypnotic repetition, Emperor, grandiose, minor scale, sinister castle melodies. But the interesting thing, I realized another thing that really makes that big riff is the harmonizing guitar under it, which I hadn't noticed until I was listening to it this like second or third time. That leads to production. The guitar rhythm bass is really good. It's sort of playing against the chord changes it's sort of playing against the shape of the arpeggios. And it actually has its own, it's not just root notes, it has its own independent thing. There's like dun 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 dun. It's sort of, there's a dun 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 towards the end, a kind of cool flourish. It's very difficult to hear, but it's present under there, which affects the sound of the whole. Isn't it kind of weird that that's buried there?
Yeah. So the production on this record, what we're really specifically talking about is guitar tone. There's a kind of give and take happening. I like the way it kind of spreads out the tremolo riffs and gives it this kind of haunting, mellifluous quality. But it doesn't really work as well in kind of the chunkier passages of this record. Like, it has a tendency to smooth out the ragged edges of the really nasty, kind of crunchy Celtic Frost Dark Throne riffs. So it's like, it's interesting. I'm wondering what prompted that decision for the band. Because it gives a sort of understated grandeur to a lot of the passages like the one that you sampled, but I feel like it takes some of the energy out of the kind of mid-pace stompy stuff. Would you agree?
Yeah, and maybe also like, yeah, it certainly works for the grandeur thing, but with the classic second wave stuff, the grand parts are also supposed to grind, right? If that second guitar, if the power chords there were boosted, it'd have more of the buzzsaw effect in the early Emperor guitars. And the meshing of those two riffs would not just make it sound like graceful and lunar, but would make it, I think maybe a more powerful and dramatic riff.
I agree.
Right now, the strange thing about this record is even though these every riff is written in the tradition of like, maliciously violent second wave black metal, it flows by in the way that's normative for nowadays black metal.
Yeah, it's a little bit too smooth for the really abrupt structures. And I think,
yes. The old Hautakammio was very much just like, this is fucking loud, it's fuzzy, there's like extra tone frying everywhere. This is also loud, but in a very different way that makes it more like continuum background listening.
No, and yeah, I agree, and me saying this, I'm not trying to blame the band for this because it's a very delicate tightrope to walk. You're looking for something consistent across everything, and you want the tremolo riffs to have this kind of searing quality, and you want the crunchier kind of dark throne parts to have that rhythmic immediacy, and it's very difficult to get that with a simple, kind of straightforward production job. I just think maybe they went a little bit too far in the direction of smoothness, and bringing it back to the center probably would have benefited this and made some of those kind of crunchy parts a little bit more exciting. So, real quick, let me get to another sample. This is going to be off the title track, Pimeyden Kosketus, and we're going to hear another one of these kind of like tour ideas of the Norwegian scene. So the first couple riffs are going to be kind of modernized interpretations of De Mysteries Dom Satanas phrases, and then they're going to spill very organically into a more triumphant kind of take style passage. And this is going to be a good example of the production working really well to the benefit of this record, smoothing out the transitions between some of these more aggressive changes in style or mood, and kind of piecing them together in a really nice way. So one of the things these guys are really good at is using just simple tricks of like drum variation and adding or removing vocals to get more juice out of the individual riffs, because there's nothing complex on this record. These are all very simple, straightforward riffs. But I think that sample is a good example of the production lending itself, through that delay and reverb to kind of slip from one melodic idea into another in a way that feels more naturalistic than it might with a raw production. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's well described. And I think when I said like the background listening thing, that's the negative side of the production, that I can just that music that's supposed to be very go for the throat can slip by too much. But the positive side is, yes, it does help create a uniform sound despite the shifts between styles, as you said. It also, and it also makes it sort of casually listenable in a way that is sometimes a good quality. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't necessarily mind the idea of really aggressive second wave stuff being kind of smooth and contiguous, because, I mean, Transylvanian Hunger was like that. I mean, everyone, like we've said on the show multiple times, everyone remembers Transylvanian Hunger from the first track, and then they ignore all the way more aggressive dissonant stuff on the backside of that record. But one of the things that makes that record work so well is that the production provides this continuous stream of sound quality that evens out the, at times, really janky, really severe switches between riffs. And then here we have a band that's both, well, maybe not better, but a little bit more current in the style of melodic switches. And then they have production that accentuates that, that provides this, wonderful kind of tonal undercurrent to everything. That meshes everything
I
together.
noticed you did a nice job of marking off the difference in those riffs. I actually noticed something in terms of the writing that smooths that over, too. So, the first riff is very mayhemic. The second one, it's like Okay, so that those big swoops, moving in these kind of half-steppy ways, very mayhem. But the da-da-dum, that drop at the end, that broader interval, that's a token thing.
Yeah, I was going to say that.
Takes,
it's like they create a bridging riff between the styles.
Exactly. No, and so the opening of the riff already is like Mayhem's mode of a kind of mournful riff, more right?
Yeah.
Da da da. But then when it drops to that da 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 to that thing at the end, it has a little more of the emotional modulation into something, definitely still sad, but more like, as much as I heaped derision on the term melancholy earlier, melancholy in a better way than the stuff on the last record.
But yeah, there's an understated sophistication to the way these guys transition between dramatic ideas. They like to use a bridging riff that kind of combines styles, creates hybrid riffs that provide this nice kind of smoothing texture between the two, but not in a way that sacrifices the quality of either.
Yeah. So now we are on to, this is a pretty straight ahead record. It's so in a lot of ways the samples we pick are going to be pretty similar, but here's one with another kind of quote unquote simple but subtle trick that only sort of masters and careful listeners of the style could pull off. So this is Lopun Ajan Alku. Lopun Ajan Alku, I don't know. And you're going to hear an inversion between which parts of the songs you'd expect to be prioritized. So you'd usually, and we've already set up this expectation on this review, usually expect the mid-tempo parts to serve more as sort of aggressive headbanging punctuation, and the trem parts to carry focal point melodies. Here, I don't know about you, but the trem parts feel more like they're sort of customary procedures being run through. Sort of like standardized runs that have this kind of intermediate between Mayhem and Toka kind of, I don't know, sad vampire, but kind of in the daylight mood. Vampire sad that the sun is coming up mood. But maybe also kind of excited because he's never seen the sun come up. But in the middle of that, it drops to the sort of the heavy chorded part that drops out of the initial blast. That's actually where the epic hook is. That's where the sort of like powerful the shading of powerful Dorian scale melody is that, occasionally will come in. And it's rhythmically inflected like a Darkthrone stomp riff. And then it seamlessly, and that's the one that has sort of this big rise. And then we go to a more dissonant riff, but it's got this flowing 6/8 drums under it, and each of the things that you'd expect to be a jam and power chord are actually sort of like, I think you referenced Dark Funeral somewhere in this review, so I'm going to say those sound kind of like Dark Funeral chords. Each one of them is like a bar chord kind of thing. And again, more atmosphere in that second stomp riff than you'd expect. And it just plays on each of those jumps from the root note happens in a place that would be a little bit different from where convention would place them.
Yeah.
So
I get what you're saying.
So yes. Yeah.
Well, yeah, just the idea that, this is... Okay, so we're, at this point, close to 30 years on from the second wave. The classic part of the second wave where the most important, so to speak, records came out. And it's always good to find a band that is not refusing modern techniques to create new spins on that sound. And I think these guys are really good at finding the places to be really rigorous and traditional, and finding the places where they can play around with the style and the ideas a little bit. Obviously, this is a record that is designed to be, at least in a large part, worshipping the traditional second wave. But they're not leaving modern techniques behind while doing it. And certain ideas like you're talking about, like the inversion of expectations and the placement of these riffs and what is supposed to be the most significant, that's a cool thing to do. And really, if things were a little bit different back in 93, maybe these ideas would have happened. All of this sounds like a possibility of the early 90s.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's kind of like that Gallows record. I think the thing that this is actually most similar to is the Gallows record we reviewed a while back.
Oh, that's interesting.
The Gallows record definitely goes for more of a ripping, full-on attack, and it's a lot more riffy, right? I mean, the goal seems to have... Rumor has it that the goal was to get 66 riffs onto the record. This is definitely not like that, but both of them are full of nudges and winks to classic black metal artists, while also really sounding kind of like they could have existed at the same time as those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like so Gyandod and the other one I would reference would be Hate Spirit, we reviewed the other week. Both those bands are carrying the second wave sound forward in different ways. While being clearly their sense of how black metal is supposed to sound is completely rooted in the early and mid 90s, but they are developing from there rather than everything that's happened in between, primarily. Whereas, this sounds like, it sounds like an alternate history, pretty convincing thing that could have existed in that cultural space at that time.
Yeah, I definitely see that. I mean, Gallows and this band could be seen as kind of sister bands. You know, Gallows is focused on sort of early 2000s, like, recreation black metal. It's like, all right, the old shit is over.
Oh, wait.
What do we do now? What?
Maybe I misremembered something about Gallows. Maybe I'm thinking of another band we reviewed recently. But I'm remembering the Gallows specifically. But what you go into? Yeah, I think you're right. It is supposed to sound like that early 2000s memories of second wave thing, which is not quite how I was characterizing it. So go on to explain that.
I don't think you were mischaracterizing it. It's like Gallows is the sound of a memory of the second wave. In the early to mid 2000s, you know, centered around bands like Avski. And, you know, Avski is a band that is clearly imitating the second wave. And then Gallows, in turn, is imitating the imitation. And after having spoken to the guys, you know, big fucking surprise, clearly that was the intent. You know, they said that we were correct in our assumptions that it is supposed to be this almost sort of meta project, the idea of, you know, a memory of a memory, you know, this game of telephone. How do you recreate old school black metal in the nowadays?
Yeah. For them it was like what we thought true black metal was when we were growing up, which was not 1993.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, these guys are attempting to be a little bit closer to the source, to be a direct thread back versus this sort of, you know, abstract idea that Gallows has. But, you know, the goal is ultimately the same, to recreate something from times past. And wonderful segue into my final sample. So, something I said up front, a lot of this record, if you're a dedicated black metal guy, you know, not to be confused with the black metal guy, the ultimate authority on all black metal, is playing the which band is this riff from game. You know, or which band is this riff idea from, rather, because there's no straight copying, obviously. So let's go to Pierres tu Hoa Valon Luaman. And we're going to have a really cool riff sequence. It's going to start with Take. And we've got to have a discussion at one point. Am I attributing just everything to Take, or is there something more obvious I'm missing? You know, from the old school. So we're going from Take to, here's where it comes in, early Dark Funeral, like Secrets of the Black Arts, like First Record and the self-titled EP. And then into Dark Throne. And this is where, you know, maybe some of the negatives of the production will come back, because there's a really cool kind of ripping Dark Throne style riff, but it doesn't have quite the energy because it's so smoothed out with a guitar tone. But ultimately, this is a pretty awesome part of the record, I think. So I think you can probably hear what I mean.
Death metal guy, keep rolling that Dark Throne riff. Duh, duh.
Yeah, I know you'd be a sucker for that. Okay, so you got that big take riff, which I'm starting to realize it feels like all those like take riffs are kind of connected to each other in a way. Like they're all like playing around the same notes. Like it's a
Yeah, I think that's a fair point.
It's a specific gesture that's happening on this record, which is fine. Then you get into that kind of like dark funeral, like flattened out mayhem style riff. Mm-hmm. But then you get to the Dark Throne riff at the end, and then the Dark Throne riff is cool. Just this like nasty kind of like Hellhammer style gestural riff of like basically 2 chords. But the production that smooths everything out, which is so advantageous to the tremolo riffs, is kind of a detriment to that. Because with that riff, I mean, just listening to it, that stomp, that intensity, you really want that nasty fucking chainsaw quality. Chords grinding against chords, you know?
Yeah. I think the thing they're trying to capture here is the way that, unlike one-dimensionally grinding or aggressive black metal guitar tone, the early stuff like Dark Throne was resonant, right? You could hear the tones ringing and bending in the dungeon space. And this certainly is a resonant sound, and you can hear cool overtones and stuff. But I know what you mean. It's, the tone is sort of smoothing over the percussive aspect of the riff. Like and in a minimalist riff like that, the rhythm really counts, right? Each of those, it's kind of about rubbing people's face in the fact that he's playing the same note over and over again. That's the point of the riff. So yeah, no, I mean, I'm never going to be against making a guitar tone, nastier. I want to say, here's a good, maybe one of the only places I can catch an anachronism on this record in terms of the actual note choice is at the end of the Dark Throne riff. Dark Throne would never finish that with a minor 6/7. The turnaround. I mean, but what an awesome way to finish it.
Like, flatten that battery into Dark Throne. There you go.
Yeah, no, that idea of just throwing the big, epic, consonant riff idea into the dissonant riff is much more common nowadays as people try to find various ways to reconstruct and draw on that second wave stuff. The funny thing is, Dark Throne would have done that on Arctic Thunder, but they wouldn't have done it before.
Hail! This is Brandon from Cromlech, and you're listening to Terminus.
And we are back from cackling hysterically to ourselves about the death metal guy's Ankylosaurus joke, never mind, with a review of a record that I did not expect to come so soon. The follow-up to Gloosh's 2020 record, Time Wheel. This is Sylvan Coven, out on the band's own label, Drevo Recordings, which I think basically also releases material by Gloosh and by Aorlhac, which is a full band that has the guy from Gloosh in it. Gloosh is a one-man thing. So, we've talked about Time Wheel on this show before. I think we played we sampled a track off it at some point, and I think I mentioned it on the year-end list for last year. It might have even snuck onto the list, I think, on my list. So this is a band from Siberia, and this project brands itself as atmospheric black metal. But before you run, listen. It's an unusual take on that. The music is nature-y in the way that you would expect sort of atmospheric black metal to be, but in a more in a way that's more rooted in actual sort of in a way that has a more spiritual grounding and a more sort of traditional grounding. It's sort of based on a Siberian shamanic approach to paganism. So perceiving a landscape animated by spirits, right? The river itself as kind of a god or a spirit, or the wind or the mountain or the trees. And the cover of that record is worth mentioning because it evokes that beautifully. It's this sort of swirling green world that has, like a fox spirit and like the form of an old man playing a flute rising up the river, stuff like that. And despite that kind of whimsical cover, it's very powerful music. And although the guys name-checked stuff like Wolves in the Throne Room, the music really sounds like early Druid and the Blazebirth Hall bands at times. And this record, you heard a little bit from Time Wheel, right?
Yeah, I've heard a couple tracks off of it, like that one that you sampled for an interlude back in the day. It's a good record from what I can tell.
Yeah, so it's anything. It is sort of the riffs powerfully evoked phenomena in nature in a very immediate way, and although it captured a lot, there was joy, playfulness, tenderness, like a full-sided perception of nature. And it had all those things that we might associate with Atmo Black in much more authentic and compelling versions than you usually get in the genre. It also had moments of, like literal storm. Like there's a great song called Clouds that just, suddenly the sky darkens at the end of the track. Right? I might throw a sample on here. And those tendencies are all... you usually expect the follow-up to move in a softer direction or something. Rather, like, all that stuff that set apart the first record from other things in the general area have been intensified. So the record of this is like... Or the cover of this has this sort of, like, kind of... We'll just say the cover might signal Atmo Black again, right? But feel free to mentally replace it with a 19th century Slavic romantic landscape painting, a bunch of pissed off Cossacks, or a nexus of rune embittered Fangfrost, because that's what you're going to get. Let's listen to your first sample.
Okay.
Unless you should say your thoughts on this one first. I just had some momentum there.
Well, I like this record a lot. It's interesting to hear the progression from what I've heard off Time Wheel onto this, because this strikes me as, at least to me, much more aggressive, much more raw, and kind of like impacting black metal. So, because the way I read Time Wheel, or at least what I've heard off it, was a sort of like, it's the great Atmo Black hope. The idea of, like, what if we took the conventions of Atmo Black, at least to some degree, and actually made good music out of them? And Gloosh did that really well by doing basically stuff that was structured like Atmo Black, but had a really dynamic harmonic language to it. Something much closer to, Russo-Ukrainian black metal proper than this sort of, like, abstract idea of atmospheric black metal that's emerged over the past few years, which is
just
still...
atmospheric black metal as a genre is decoupled from music for the most part.
Yeah, atmospheric black metal, like, the way people talk about it on the internet is so goddamn weird and has seemingly nothing to do with any actual scene. It's something that just exists on the internet. But Gloosh steps in, takes a lot of those ideas, and makes something actually good out of them. But now, on this record, we have something that's still reflective, at least to a degree, of that idea, but it's really, at least to my ears, a much more pure and just, like, aggressive black metal record. So, let's listen to Woodland Waltz, not to be confused with Woodsman's Walk off the Robes of Snow and... Yeah. Not to be confused off the Robes of Snow and Moldrion split. And I'll talk about some of the influences that I really detect after we listen to this. So the whole idea of being folky or folk-influenced in black metal has taken a lot of shapes over the years. Anywhere from, like, smart people can recognize the folk in Emperor and, into more obvious stuff like Bach de Civ Fiel from around the same idea. Moving into stuff that is like folk black metal, which we probably for the most part don't enjoy. But then, really appreciating the folk undercurrent of black metal itself is something that seems to be coming back right now. A lot of the riffs on this record are centered around simple kind of folky phrases. The idea of, obviously a lot of the tremolo riffs on this record are going to be very kind of Graveland inspired, like Following the Voice of Blood or earlier. But also what I really detect on this record is a big influence, like bigger than the previous one, from Branikald in particular. Especially early Branikald, the real cassette stuff, this song in particular, Woodland Waltz, could be something off a Stormride,
Yeah, okay, I hear that.
Mm-hmm. And then, so Branikald would obviously flatten it out into something simpler and more just looping continuously for God knows how many minutes, creating that trance-like effect. But here, these ideas are compressed down into these simple phrases which then split off in really dramatic ways into other ideas. Something about this record which really struck me is that these songs are composed kind of like suites of individual ideas connecting, rather than the kind of continuous flow we usually expect from black metal. Each of these songs, and they tend to be fairly long songs, are based off of, 3-4 ideas that have, a minute and a half, 2 minutes apiece to express themselves, and then there's some connective tissue that links them to the next one. Which sometimes could sound janky, or could sound a little bit incoherent, but this guy is really good at linking those ideas and creating these kind of abstract pictures of nature that the best black metal always does.
Yeah. So for a precedent for some of that sort of more Blazebirth sounding stuff, would it interest you at all to check out a quick clip from the end of a track on the last record? Because I think this is a side of that record that's been brought out here. Let me just double check and I'll bring it up. So that was the end of that song, Clouds, I was talking about from Time Wheel. It's a pretty cool part, right?
Oh, yeah. Very old school BBH.
Yeah, and you can tell how he starts on those big droning Druid chords, and there are more of that on Time Wheel. And, you can imagine a sort of slow-moving wall of clouds, and then just, bang, slides right in, right? Sort of like the wind picks up, and you get this this riff that takes those big wide chords and narrows them down into like 2-string chords that have this more biting, immediately melodic rather than harmonic quality. And it's got that sort of a shape that has more to do with those sort of free-flowing, vaguely folk-based melodies in the BBH, right? Da, 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 da. It sort of stutters in a weird place that you wouldn't expect. And so it's kind of like there are some other moments like that on Time Wheel, but it really sounds to me like he's taken the energy of moments like that and built them out into this whole record, which is like, about as cool a possible... I didn't think he was going to do that, and like that's like the best possible option. So that Cloud sample and then the Woodland Waltz, right? The Woodland Waltz tonally, a lot like the harmonies in there are very, basically the same you get on Clouds, and there are other parts of Time Wheel it evokes. There are also some much darker, more tense harmonies throughout this record, and we get a little bit of that creeping into the folkish melody here on Hexenring. So listen for the power chord tritone. It's in there, I swear. Did you catch that drum fake out?
Yeah, a little bit. I was so focused on the way the lead just never stops, you know?
Yeah, so we start out in a blasting section with a palette that's kind of close to the more storming parts of Time Wheel and kind of just to the samples we both played, right? Goes into this little more, this sort of more turbulent Slavic folk melody, kind of da 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 da, right? And then it drops. The drums cue like we're going to like halftime or something. Stutter, blast. It's kind of a similar fake out to the just dip into the blast part at the end of Clouds. And yeah, the sustain on that is crazy. He's just gone through... This sort of thing just isn't done much in nowadays black metal. He's gone through 2 intense blast riffs. He fakes you out, and then he drops you into the center of the song, which is entirely based on relentless blasting. And yeah, and so underneath it, you've got that buzz sawing kind of boom, 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 bum, bum, kind of emperor tritones, and over it, that has this folk melody angle, but it's a lot more dissonant. And then you know, that kind of sinuous thing you could hear on a like Thousand Swords, maybe Graveland or something like that. But yeah, it just doesn't end.
I really like the idea of, and this is something we're starting to see more nowadays. The idea of not so much having a continuous riff and the lead changes over it, but a continuous lead and the rhythm riff changes under it. Which is a really sophisticated, interesting technique. Because what it does is, you know, it alters the context of the lead. You know, the lead means something different as it hovers over each riff underneath it. That's really cool. It's a really elaborate way to create a continuous thread through a song, but constantly change the underlying mood and rhythm of it.
Yeah, for sure. It's a thing he didn't really have on Time Wheel. One thing that was remarkable at Time Wheel is the whole album is made from a single substance. It's just these rich, dense rhythm guitar chords, and that's what you get all the way through. Flowing through several very, very nuanced harmonic modes, right? But like, it just is that tone. He's introduced these more free-floating lead guitars and stuff like that. And yes, they're not working like conventional leads. It's that melody basically is the song, is the core of the song. It's going to drop out a bit, and then he will introduce a more doom variation in the riff underneath it. And then that riff will become a little less ominous and dissonant and a little more textured and ringing. And it will almost sound like the lead has faded out, but it hasn't. And like your brain will still supply it, and then it comes back.
Yeah.
And this is another evocation of natural form in the music. Just like you can hear the storming clouds on on that last track. The track's called Hexenring, right? Witch circle in the woods, right? Like circle of mushrooms or circle of standing stones. That's the ring, right? You can hear the witches looping around the ring in that like iterative looping phrase. Towards the end of this song, yeah, you're talking about sonic events here. The end of the song, we actually get like witch singing, and there are new riffs, like suddenly. There's like dramatic events happening in the songs in a way that is kind of above and beyond.
Yeah, no, the idea that there is a meta progression in these songs beyond the simple riff to riff format is something that basically every great black metal band does.
Mm-hmm. And the thing that strikes me is that it's more than the conventional, like at this point we talk about like the big back end riff, right? 2/3 of the way through you pull out the riff you've been saving, right?
Yeah.
he pretty consistently, he'll like do something in the last quarter or eighth of the song, and it's like a decisive turn, right? It's like that thing he did on Clouds becomes a general principle here. And so, you know, like 3/4 of the way through Hexenring, which is otherwise remarkably continuous and a 9-minute song, more than 3/4 through, we get this like new riffing and like female clean vocals and all that. It's structurally interesting.
Yeah, definitely. So, one thing I want to bring up with my next sample is I detect, and I want your input on this as a guy who has a pretty solid and sophisticated knowledge of greater Rus black metal, so to speak. The Mist of Sleep. I detect a subtle but really intense undercurrent of death metal on this record. You know, we've talked here and there about the idea of, you know, black metal hegemony, about how basically everything sounds like black metal now because it's had this kind of sprawling influence over everything. But I think this is a guy who listens to black metal sincerely in the way that older Russian and Ukrainian bands did, and really incorporates it into his black metal.
I think you meant death metal. Because...
Yeah.
You said listened to black metal. I mean, to be fair, I definitely enjoy listening to black metal sincerely and incorporating it into black metal.
Yeah, listening to death metal sincerely and incorporating it into black metal. Yes, thank you for that save. All right, so there's going to be an obvious note, and I'm going to give that to you, you know, to bring up. We've talked about it before. But let's listen to the first couple minutes of The Mist of Sleep and then talk about that as a possible aspect to this record. It's the one that's like dun 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 dun. You know, that's it.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you can perceive that as like a kind of...
Oh, this one.
Yeah, that would be considered a nowadays kind of bridging black metal riff, but just listening to it, it's like I get a death metal energy from that. Just that punching, sort of driving energy behind it. That reminds me of shit that I've heard in, Deicide, Morbid Angel, stuff like that. And I think that the death metal quality has always been important to Ukrainian and Russian black metal. And the example is going to be obvious, and I will give it to you. To quote.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've talked on the show before about Hate Forest as a band that is as influenced by Bolt Thrower. And, well, I mean, like, the Hate Forest formula is basically, like, Eternus, Hades, Bolt Thrower. There's one more that I'm going to be forgetting in there. Maybe like Graveland. Bolt Thrower is a core influence for that. Eternus is also kind of a death metal band, depending. Important. And is kind of a dark metal band, and yet pioneered a lot of the glorious sounding guitar techniques used by the Slavs in some ways. So, I hear that. I hear the death metal energy. It sounds to me like a black metal riff, but it also sounds more consonant to me than it does to you. They're just very close consonant intervals that make it sound kind of folky still, I think. I'm not humming it right, though.
No,
it is very hard to hum.
I get what you're saying. It's consonant, but also couldn't it be one of the more consonant riffs on Blessed Are the Sick?
I was about to concede that to you. Yes, it could. It could be one of the more consonant. It could definitely be on Blessed Are the Sick. It could also be on Covenant. It could be like one of the more sort of like tense kind of neoclassical sounding riffs on Covenant. The other stuff it sounds like is the death metal-y riffs by Dissection, which I'm sure sound like Morbid Angel. So this sort of nexus of black, sort of like sinister spiritual death metal or death-tending black metal of the early and mid-90s. I hear that for sure. That makes sense to me. And I think, and also just, we've talked about this on the show too, just influenced by, that punching, driving energy used to be in black metal when the black metal people were listening to Morbid Angel and Deicide and stuff. So, pre-Nightside Emperor sounds like that. Early Mayhem sounds like that. But those are ideas. When I think of black metal, I think of that energy, but it's certainly not where the genre has gone. And also, that level of attack is not associated with, say, the Blazebirth Hall bands. Unless you're talking about,
Oh, no, definitely. I think that especially after doing the show with you and talking about it more, I think the importance of death metal's influence into early black metal is kind of underrated. And I think it still filters in weird ways. I mean, like the obvious one is, like you said, Hate Force covering Bolt Thrower. Clearly, it's been very important to deep, intense black metal scenes throughout the years. And I feel like there's more of that than usual on this record, especially in those really kind of gnarly riffs that are still tremolo, still have a black metal energy to them. However, a lot of the chording, a lot of the basic melodic ideas strike me as very death metal in certain ways.
They're also he's good at the very propulsive, rhythmically frantic kind of riffing that isn't.
Yeah.
Again, that was more common in the 90s, but even then the black metal bands often favored more drawn-out phrases. So that I hear that. Also, this would be a moment to talk about the production. So that's another place in which everything that was most distinctive about Time Wheel, everything that made it different from the expected Atmo black thing, or even expected folky pagan black metal from, a Slavic country, has been boosted up. So Time Wheel is notable for being loud and for having a beefy, even somewhat noisy guitar tone that was very forward and substantial. Just this thick tone running through the whole thing. This record is louder, as you pointed out. It's basically the same tone, which is an outstanding one, but it's, pushed to the foreground. And again, it's asking, although a lot of the melodic ideas are coming out of this Slavic tradition of black metal, and it's asking to be listened to in a way that's very different from how people have come to listen to it.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, actually engaging with it immediately rather than leaving it as sort of background meditation music.
Yes, this insists on not being background music.
Yes.
And that's part of, like, the way the riffing... One reason that the riffing on this record is so masterful, right? It's... Again, this was present before, but now it's brought out more, right? Kind of the opposite of what was happening on that Aorlhac record, sadly, is that this record had the kind of clarity that Aorlhac at their best did. Which is like every single riff has this clearly defined form. It's not just, we're not dealing with the sort of nebulous vortex of, sort of searching Branikald guitar parts, right? There's like shapes seen in the storm wind, right? Or like lightning caught in slow motion. So you got some chugs on here. So there's another death metalism for you, in a way. Although they're not really death metal chugs, but the chording and the riffing is definitely pretty dissonant. But I guess what we're getting here is another example of what seems to be one of the main techniques this guy has, which is you move from those more lush, droning, drug, maybe hate foresty type chords. You have the big sorrowful melody descending. Da, 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 da. You let it ring out, And then from that broad harmonic range, right, you focus it. And instead of just going to those like 2-string chords, it's now focused down to just like chug and power chords, right? It's the sharpest it's been. So it's like the most dramatic version of that sort of like broad to focused, broad to narrowed spectrum. And then at the end, he draws it back out again, broadens the sound again. And a lot of bands just only work within one of those orbits. Like, it's either the big, lush chords, or it's like we are a, 2-string chord band. And he's just constantly moving back and forth between those. There are also a couple specific reference points in that part. That's the chug part is notable for still sounding very Druidky, and what it really sounds like is the most energetic, furious Druid record and a Terminus favorite, the Swan Road, and a specific song on it called Glare of 1868. And maybe also there's this moment at the last Winterfilleth album where Absolved in Fire breaks out into these chugs. Yes, the underused Slavonic pagan black metal chug.